Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to what is going to be a fantastic conversation. And I would say from the very beginning, Vanessa, when you come next time, we will definitely book a much bigger space. It is for all of us, a great pleasure to see that after 3 years of being away from each other, we can again be in the same room and be in the same room with such a fabulous person. It has been a strong tradition at the IMF to have this IMF inspired with young women who make such a difference, that are changing, women that are changing our world for the better. And today's speaker is no exception. I'm delighted to have the privilege to introduce Vanessa Nakate. As many of you know, Vanessa is a climate justice activist from Uganda. Her work at the intersection of climate change, social justice, and women's rights is truly an inspiration. She has written one of the most important books on climate, My Fight to Bring New African Voice to the Climate Crisis. And her actions are highly recognized around the world. You may probably have seen her on Time magazine cover, calling for a Green Deal for everyone. And she was recognized last year as one of the 25 most influential women of 2021 by no other but the Financial Times. Vanessa, the Financial Times for many economists around us is like the Bible, so it's a big deal. And just last month, she became a Goodwill ambassador for UNICEF in recognition of her global advocacy for climate justice. In Vanessa's words, climate change is more than statistics. It is more than a data point. It is more than net zero targets. It is about people being impacted right now. And I could not agree with her more. Humanity can survive recessions. It can survive inflation, as painful as they may be. But we cannot survive an unmitigated climate crisis. If temperatures are to jump 3 or 4 degrees, we are cooked. Vanessa is a powerful voice for African people who are so unfairly suffering the consequences of a changing climate. They have not caused the crisis they live with. So, dear Vanessa, thank you for joining us. I just want to express my gratitude for all you do. Keep doing it. And also recognize Sabina Bhatia, our Deputy Secretary of the department arranging all these meetings at the fund. Sabina has dedicated a great deal of her time and her energy to ensure that at the IMF we listen to the voices of people like Vanessa. So, join me in what is going to be a fantastic, stimulating conversation, passing the baton to Sabina and Vanessa from here on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristalina, and a very warm welcome to you, Vanessa, and congratulations on being named UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. We're very delighted to have you here. And a very warm welcome to our audience here in the room and online. I must say it's great to be back here in person after 3 years. So, Vanessa, Africa produces less than 4% of the world's emissions, and yet the continent is at the sharp end of the climate crisis. Many of us in this room have not experienced that. Take us to the front lines and paint us a picture of what the crisis looks like from your perspective.
Thank you so much. This is one of the horrible realities of this crisis, that those that are on the front lines are the ones who are not responsible for this crisis. And speaking from my very own country, Uganda, we've seen changes in weather patterns. We've seen flooding, we've seen landslides, we've seen droughts. And, you know, in a country that heavily depends on rain, or that heavily depends on agriculture, or rain-fed agriculture to be specific, it is harmful for many farmers, for many communities when climate disasters occur. We recently had flooding in the region of Mbale, and the people said that they had never seen flooding like that before. It left a lot of devastation. It left a lot of suffering, because in the end, people lose their farms, people lose their homes, people lose their businesses, people lose their livelihoods. And to go beyond Uganda, we've seen, you know, flooding across East Africa. We've seen the droughts in the Horn of Africa that have left more than 20 million people with no access to food. We've seen how cyclones have ripped apart large parts of the southern part of the African continent. To speak of the cyclone Idai, which affected so many communities in southern Africa in 2019, and it left more than 1,300 people dead, and many more were recorded as missing. And since Cyclone Idai, we've seen more cyclones affect the southern part, you know, of the African continent. We are seeing water sources shrink, like the water sources of Lake Chad. So these are some of the things that we are seeing that are happening across the African continent, and how people are really suffering. Climate change is happening right now, and it's not something that we expect to come in the future.
And Vanessa, you were recently in the Horn of Africa, and you saw firsthand the impact of the drought on children. Talk to us about that.
Yes, so just a few weeks back, I visited a region in the Horn of Africa with UNICEF, that is Turkana in Kenya, and I got to meet different mothers. I got to meet the people in the community to really understand the impact that, you know, they have experienced as a result of the worst drought that this region has seen in 40 years. And one of the mothers I met, Dorcas and Hassan, Milka, I remember engaging with her and asking her when, you know, Milka started to get sick, because he was suffering from malnutrition as many other children across Turkana. And she told me that Milka was born into malnutrition, because there is no food to eat, there is no water. And even for herself, the mother, she didn't have access to food. And with more engagements I had, you know, with the different mothers, they explained to me that because of the drought situation, most of the men moved with the animals to look for pasture, to look for water. So I realized that in many of the crises that we see around the world, women and children are on the front lines. And I got to understand how many mothers are struggling to find food for their children, because even with the treatments that they're receiving for the malnutrition, you know, the treatment or the dosage may be completed, but then there is still no food, and the cycle continues of children suffering with more malnutrition. I got to visit some of the hospitals where children with severe acute malnutrition are referred for treatment. And it was devastating to see what was really happening, to see how much this crisis could have been prevented, and how much the suffering of children could have been prevented. And I met another child there with his grandmother, and I got to learn that because the family couldn't access treatment in time, he really got in a situation that the health workers were calling a wasted situation when it comes to severe acute malnutrition. And by evening, we found out that he had passed away. This could have been a preventable death. This could have been another, preventable crisis and suffering of children. So this is what I saw in Turkana. And yeah, I've said many times that climate change is more than weather, it's more than statistics, it's more than net zero targets. But when I was in Turkana, I got to really understand the meaning of those words, because it goes beyond the statistics to you actually seeing that children are starving, children are suffering from severe acute malnutrition, and their mothers are helpless. They don't know where to get food, they don't know where to get water because of the increase in crisis. And of course, in the process, even the biodiversity, the animals have died as a result of this drought. So this is like a picture of something that I saw while in Turkana.
It's heart-wrenching stories, Vanessa, and it's precisely because of the devastating impact that climate change is having in Africa that you, became an activist, right? And you started your movement, the Rise Up movement in Kampala. So talk to us about, how you got started and where do you see your movement going now?
Yes, when I, in 2018, I started to do research about some of the challenges that were affecting the lives of the people in my country, Uganda. And at that time, I found that climate change was one of those challenges. And it really surprised me to find it as a problem, because I remember learning about it in school, but I never really got the urgency, or like when I learned about it, I never really got to understand how serious it was and how it was already affecting people's lives. So I was really pushed to read more about it, to get to understand what really causes it and what are the impacts that people experience. And in my research, I got to know that some of these impacts I was already seeing in Uganda, for example, with the flooding and landslides in regions of Bududa, regions of Bundibujo, that is in the eastern part of the country. And that really triggered me to want to do something about it. And being inspired by Greta from Sweden, I also started to strike for the climate every Friday to raise awareness about what was happening and hoping that the leaders would listen and do something about it. In the process, I started to speak to some of my friends from school about the climate strikes and about the need to advocate for, climate action. And many of my friends were a bit hesitant about it, because by the time the Fridays for Future movement was being reported as one that is, mainly for teenagers. So we were in college, so many of us were in our 20s, 21. So some of my friends didn't feel like they could fit within the movement. So I asked them if we can call ourselves Youth for Future, so we can still do the strikes, but we identify ourselves as Youth for Future. And that's when some of them started to join the climate strike. So we were just a group called Youth for Future from university. And it's later on that we became the Rise Up movement. And what we've really been doing as Rise Up is to help create awareness about what is happening, not only in Uganda, but across the African continent when it comes to the climate crisis. And also to help amplify the voices of those that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, because we've seen how many activists have faced challenges, in having their voices listened to, in having, in being in these platforms where decisions are being made. We've seen this at the COPs, for example, the one in Glasgow. Many activists from Africa struggled to go to Glasgow to represent their communities. And we are seeing the same thing happening even with COP27, which is happening in Africa. It's being called an African COP, but then what makes it an African COP is not the fact that it's on African soil. It must have African voices. But as I speak right now, many African activists are struggling to find accreditation to attend the COP, which is in just a few weeks. They're struggling to find funding. So again, it's these things that that we really need to change, that those on the front lines are on the front pages, in the rooms where decisions about our planet are being made. And also through my activism, I started a project that involves the installation of solar panels and eco-friendly cookstoves to try to drive our transition to renewable energy and clean cooking in schools in Uganda. So what I really hope that we can do as Rise Up movement, or when we finally have it registered, is to reach more communities, to reach more schools with climate education, to reach more schools with the installations, and to also continue creating these spaces where activists can tell their stories and their experiences of their communities. Because as we grow older, more activists are rising up, so we need to create that space for the activists that will come up to, so that they can have a space and platform where they can be supported and also amplify the work that they're doing. I believe every activist has a story to tell, and every story has a solution to give, and every solution has a life to change. So we hope that we can make those things happen.
Wow, powerful words indeed. And you've also taken to social media. I follow you on Twitter and Instagram. And I see that, and we're going to throw up some of your slogans on the screen, very powerful ones. We cannot eat coal, we cannot drink oil. Wow. And this is my favorite. No time left for blah, blah, blah. Right? Yeah, no, I think it's an important message. And educate girls for climate. Okay, that is very powerful. So on that, in your book, A Bigger Picture, and here's Vanessa's book, and Kristalina mentioned it. It truly is an excellent book for those of you who want to be activists. It's sort of a blueprint. And in this book, Vanessa, you draw the link between climate justice and women's rights. And you argue very convincingly that the fight against climate change is inextricably linked with the fight for women's rights and girls' rights. How so?
Yes, so in my journey of activism, to speak from my college, I did a bachelor's in business administration, so I didn't have much information about climate or environmental issues. So most of it was learning from other activists, learning through articles. So in my journey of activism, I remember an article I read that was talking about the impacts of the climate crisis on women and girls in some African countries. And I remember it had a title that was, that had something like climate brides, something of that sort. So when I read that article, I got to learn that in some communities, when the climate disasters affect the people in the communities, they are left with nothing, many times left with no, their businesses or farms are destroyed, or their homes, so they're left with nothing. And they start to think about the children who can stay in school and the children who have to drop out because there is no enough money to keep every child in school. And for many of the families, they would say and decide that the girls drop out of school, and it was a priority for the boys to stay in school. And the article went on to explain that when some of these girls dropped out of school, their families would force them into early marriages with an expectation of bride price, which bride price would help the family recover from the impact of the climate crisis. So that was the first time I got to really understand how climate change is exacerbating child marriages and also dropping out of school for many girls. And I also got to understand how in so many communities, especially in the rural areas, women have responsibilities of providing food and water for their families. So they have to, walk long distances. For example, if water sources are dried up in search of water, and many times exposed to gender-based violence as they collect this water. And for the, to speak about the water specifically, when I was in Turkana, I got to learn from some of the mothers that, they go in search of water and then they sleep at the water source, because by the time they get to the water source, it's already dark because it's already a very long way there. So they go to the water source and then they sleep there and resume the journey back. And yeah, so that was like something that I had from one of the mothers, that when there is drought or when there's no access to water, they have to walk long distances. So I got to know that climate change, again, it's more than weather, and it's about the people and how it's impacting people's lives, how it's impacting education of girls, how it's impacting women in communities, and how, there is a need to really address the intersections of climate change and women and girls issues. And that's why in some of the hashtags that I've used, there is a hashtag that talks about educate girls for climate. Project Drawdown lists 100 things that we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and very often education is ranked among the top 10 solutions, but many times we don't talk about it as a possible climate solution. So it goes on to explain how girls' education and women empowerment can help reduce already existing inequalities that women and girls face, but also help build resilience for women and girls in this, in the world where climate disasters, can happen anytime, and it can also help reduce greenhouse gas emissions all at the same time. So we see that there is a way climate change, affects women and girls, but we also know there is something that we can do to not only address the issue of climate justice, but to also address girls' education and women empowerment all at the same time.
Very powerful. It's quite interesting, actually, because even in the pandemic, you saw that women and girls especially, bore a disproportionate share of the burden, right? And were impacted. And you see the same with climate change, and women and girls as change makers. Very powerful. I want to now turn to a subject that's very much top of mind and will be especially at our meetings, and that is on energy security. And we've seen that despite all the international commitments, the world is not quite ready to wean itself off fossil fuels, especially now when so many countries are facing an energy crisis which comes on top of a climate crisis, which Kristalina has described as shock upon shock upon shock. So my question to you, Vanessa, is how can countries, especially countries, for example, like yours, Uganda, address both their energy needs for development and tackle climate change?
Yeah, thank you. For that question specifically, I do have something written down. And I just want to say that, excuse me, you cannot address one without the other. And people all around the world are struggling to be able to afford energy. And I've seen it even in my country, Uganda. And in Africa, we know that hundreds of people are, living in extreme poverty. And it's not just poverty, but also energy poverty. But I want to be clear, very clear about this. We will not solve energy poverty by funding new fossil fuel infrastructure in Africa. Oil and gas companies have been promising to lift people out of energy poverty for decades, but it's been a lie, and there is evidence for that. The pipelines and power lines from coal and oil and gas will never reach those who live at the last mile, and they know this. The new oil and gas that leaders are talking about funding in Africa will be going onto ships and heading to Europe. It's a hard truth, but that is the truth. The profits will line with the pockets of people who are already rich. And when that new fossil fuel infrastructure has to become obsolete in the next couple of years or decades, the resulting debt will suffocate African countries that are already drowning in suffering and in existing debt. I believe the only way to help lift Africans out of energy poverty is through distributed renewable energy. And that's the cheapest, fastest way to get energy to people that are living at the last mile. As the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has said quite very clearly, investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is economic and moral madness. All of this means that the global north and institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the MDBs must seize this moment to double down on investments for renewable energy in Africa and across the global south. But I believe we will have a chance to have a more detailed discussion about this. But for the time being, let us put this lie of fossil fuels as a bridge for wealth to Africa. Let us put it aside, because we've seen investments in some African countries. They have not brought the prosperity that has been promised. In fact, they have brought human rights violations and more poverty in these regions, because in the end, the profits don't end with the people in those communities. The profits end in the global north. In the end, it is those communities that suffer, the impacts of this oil. They're the ones that have to suffer when oil spills happen. They're the ones that have to suffer with polluted air, polluted water, polluted soils, polluted food, polluted farms. But then the profits and, the oil or the coal or the gas, it is exported to the very countries that are promising profits for the African nations. So if you want to call fossil fuels a bridge for Africa, then let's be very accurate about it. Fossil fuels are a bridge to nowhere, or maybe they are a bridge to somewhere worse than what the African continent is already experiencing as a result of the climate crisis.
Wow, powerful words. Truly, fossil fuels are a bridge to nowhere. We will keep that in mind, Vanessa. We hear you loud and clear. I know the issue of climate finance is very dear to you. You've talked a lot about it. You spoke about it at the UNGA last month. This week we have ministers of finance from 190 countries gathering here in Washington. If you had one ask to make of them on the issue of climate finance, what would that be?
Yeah, I also have notes for that.
Oh, okay. We are taking notes for that.
Yeah, so before I answer that, can I just say that a recent report found that the World Bank had supported fossil fuel projects and policies with $14.8 billion since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, despite pledging to stop its support of fossil fuels by 2019. And a second report found that out of the $17.2 billion in climate financing it reported in 2020, almost $7 billion is completely untraceable. On top of that, Mr. Malpass, the president of the World Bank, recently refused to declare that climate change is man-made. So it's time for the World Bank to get serious about the climate crisis. We need the World Bank to end funding for fossil fuels, to be transparent about its climate financing, and have a president who will treat the climate crisis like a crisis. But to answer your initial question, I would ask leaders who are gathering here for three things. First, I would ask all leaders to put people at the heart of all decisions about the energy and the climate crisis. You must make decisions that truly help safeguard the lives of vulnerable people, not stuff even more money into the pockets of the rich. I remember being in a meeting of indigenous leaders a few months back, and there is one thing I learned from them. They say that whenever they wanted to make a decision in the community, they sat and asked themselves, will this decision impact the children negatively or positively? And the moment they realized that there was a room for any negative impact, that decision would be immediately cancelled and another decision would be thought about. So that is the first thing I want. Whatever decision that you make, is it good for the children or not? Then second, I would like to ask the World Bank and multilateral development banks to use this moment to end finance for all new fossil fuel development and double down on finance for renewable energy in Africa and across the global south. And that finance must come in the form of grants, not loans, which only add more debt to already existing debt. And thirdly, I would like to ask the finance ministers to call for loss and damage to be put on the format agenda at COP27. We have spent decades talking about how to help climate vulnerable communities deal with the loss and damage they're already suffering from, and enough is enough. We've done so much talking. We need to do something now. It's time to take action and create a loss and damage fund with real money. Loss and damage is happening right now. The climate crisis is pushing many communities beyond their ability to adapt. Mitigation is important, adaptation is important, but now we must address something that is beyond adaptation, and that is loss and damage. Because you can't adapt to extinction, you can't adapt to starvation, you cannot adapt to the loss of your cultures, you cannot adapt to the loss of your coastlines, you cannot adapt to submerged islands, you cannot adapt to the loss of your culture, to the loss of your history, to the loss of your traditions. So we need finance ministers to support the agenda for loss and damage at COP27.
I think, Vanessa, you make some very important points. They are provocative, but I think it's important for us here in this room to hear these perspectives. And I can assure you, and we have a very vibrant civil society here also at our meetings, that we will be discussing these issues. And I hope that you will be able to join us actually in some of our online conversations. And you were talking about, and I assume that this loss and damage, this will be something that you all will raise at COP27, right, which is going to be next month in Egypt. It's been dubbed the African COP. Now, are you optimistic that we are going to make progress, not just on loss and damage, but on other aspects and more international commitments? Do you see us, the countries coming together? And what will you be doing at COP27?
Well, I think for me, I have to be optimistic. I must expect that something good will come out of this, because activism is a lot of work, and you need to have something. You need to expect something good to come out of what you're doing, because it can be frustrating. It can be devastating. You put yourself in vulnerable situations. You meet communities. You meet people who are actually suffering. Because when we find ourselves in climate conferences, you realize there is a huge gap between what is being discussed in the halls and what is happening on the ground. Because in the halls, people will say, we still need to talk more, but how long are we going to talk? How many dialogues or how many conversations are we going to have? A child that is starving has no time, to wait for a conversation to end, or a mother who is struggling to find food has no time for, a dialogue to decide whether she can live tomorrow or she's going to die today as a result of, starvation or, or no access to water at all. So you find yourself in places whereby people don't understand what the impact of the climate crisis is and how people are really suffering. So in those spaces, it's important for me, myself, to have hope, to find something to be hopeful for, because it's that hope that gives me the strength to keep saying another world is not only necessary for us, but it's actually possible. It's that hope that gives me the expectation that no child will have to starve to death, or no community will have to live in fear for their farms or for their islands to be washed away, or their coastlines. It's that hope that we must all have, because people are suffering and we must do something. We must do something about it. And in these spaces, you need that hope. You need that hope to be able to see the light. And
Thank you, Vanessa. I think it is a somber moment for us. We get a lot of inspiration from you. This is the IMF Inspired event. You have inspired us. You've given us a lot of food for thought. For that, we thank you. And really, I want to thank you personally from the bottom of my heart for actually bringing the issues of justice, equity, to the heart of the climate conversations. So with that, we're going to call it a wrap. And a hand out, please. Ladies and gentlemen, Vanessa Nakate. Thank you. That was very nice. That was very good.